there is a strong appetite out there, I'm finding, to engage with topics that a few years ago might have been regarded as very fringe. But Escaping from Eden asked the question, does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs? And you're quite right, David, that it surprises a lot of people that a senior churchman would even ask the question, would entertain the possibility that we might be in a populated universe and that our contact in the past, what's called paleo contact, might have had some kind of a direct role in our development as a species.
Hi, I'm David Lovegrove. Welcome to the Portal channel. My guest today is Paul Anthony Wallis. Paul's a very interesting person. He's an author and he's become quite well known in the field called paleo contact, which is what some people call ancient aliens, the study of the possibilities of humans' interaction in times past with ancient aliens, with high-tech civilizations. And it's a field I've always been interested in. My main thing on this channel is human superpowers, the things that are considered also impossible, but they're more about innate powers in humans. But I've always found the whole UFOs, flying saucers, ancient aliens thing very interesting. And when I first saw Paul's channel, The Fifth Kind, I was taken with the fact that he was actually an Anglican minister. He'd been an Anglican minister, a priest for 30 years. He'd studied translation, he'd taught translation and hermeneutics. So he was somebody that I could listen to, as somebody that I thought would be surely an expert in his field. And I then discovered that Paul was well known to Erich von Däniken, and Erich had even written a glowing recommendation of one of his books, and Paul has interviewed him and become friends with him. The famous George Noory from the show Coast to Coast had also called Paul the new von Däniken. But Paul and I talk mostly about spiritual things, about his understanding of the Bible and particularly the New Testament, particularly the words of Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, and what Paul thought was the real message, looking into the actual meanings of the words in the Gospels. And so I think this is a very important and interesting talk. So I hope you agree, and I'd like to ask you to subscribe if you really enjoy this and tell your friends about it. We made the video by Zoom and something happened technically and you don't see me throughout the video, which is no great loss, but you see Paul and you hear his warm and interesting voice and his terrific opinions. So I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks so much for that intro. And David, thank you for having me on your show today. We're going to have a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed catching up the other day. And I can see that you and I have a lot in common in terms of our areas of interest today, and probably something about the route we've taken to get here as well. The latest two books that I've written, Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden, I think they're my 9th and 10th books, but they're the ones that are really getting traction and that are really selling because there is a strong appetite out there, I'm finding, to engage with topics that a few years ago might have been regarded as very fringe. But Escaping from Eden asked the question, does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs. And you're quite right, David, that it surprises a lot of people that a senior churchman would even ask the question, would entertain the possibility that we might be in a populated universe and that our contact in the past, what's called paleo contact, might have had some kind of a direct role in our development as a species. So that's what I look at in Escaping from Eden. And my way into it was the study of ancient texts, the Bible in particular. Because when I was training pastors, it was in the areas of the history of Christian thought and hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is the science of interpretation, the principles of interpreting ancient texts so that you get out of the texts what the writer intended you to, and that you can begin to understand the context of what you're reading as well. So that was my area when I was involved in training pastors, and all of that keeps the student and the teacher continually engaged with the texts, with the Bible in particular for me. And in my studies of the Bible, I could see that there were anomalies in the stories that Christianity has traditionally told, and Judaism has traditionally told from the Hebrew canon in particular. The stories we tell don't entirely match what's in the texts. And then there are these odd moments, these anomalous things that happen that clue you that something might be a little awry in the translation here and there. And it was those anomalies that caught my attention, and just waited for the moment when I had enough time to say, okay, I need to drill down into that because our current explanation of that doesn't make sense. What's really going on there? And I would go in with a linguist's brain because languages was my first love. I was very fortunate growing up in the UK that in the public school system, I got to learn French, German, Latin, went on to learn Italian, Portuguese, and Greek. And so when I go to a text to work out what it's saying, my first question is always, what do the words mean? And it was that question that took me down the rabbit hole that led to this whole area of paleo contact, and reveals, and I share this journey step by step with the reader in Escaping from Eden. It reveals a whole other story hidden in plain sight in the Bible that reveals a quite different explanation of human origins and a quite different explanation, therefore, of human potential. So that was Escaping from Eden. And then the Scars of Eden followed on from that. I go more widely around the world, sit at the feet of the elders who have curated ancestral narratives in cultures in every country around the world through the ages, and realize that there are phenomenal correlations in their explanations of who we are as a species, where we came from, and what company we're in, and what the implications of that are. And I argue in the Scars of Eden that there's been a great confusion in human thought. The subtitle is, Has Humanity Confused the Idea of God with Memories of ET Contact? And I point to where that confusion may have happened and the legacy that's left behind in our psychology as a species, and all the, what I would say are artifacts of paleo contact that show up in our geopolitics, even in the 21st century.
I was an original Stan Deo cosmic conspiracy believer in the 70s when I was a young fella. I don't know if you've ever read that.
I haven't, but I have read Eric von Daniken, and I think I read Chariots of the Gods 3 years after you did, David.
Right.
When I was about 11 years old. And that was a game changer for me. And in a funny way, it's a kind of a counterpart story to yours, because it was reading Eric von Daniken that led me into the world of Christianity, because I found that he was highlighting some ultimate questions that took me on the track to considering God, considering the story of Jesus. But in the first instance, he had put his finger on our inability to explain ourselves as an intelligent, conscious, technological species. And I felt that this was a bit of a taboo that he was naming, because at 11 years old, I was in school. I spent some time in Church of England school. I was now in a mainstream state school. And so I was hearing the two meta-narratives of Orthodox Christianity and then mainstream science to explain who we are. And both of them had glaring gaps in explaining how come we are the alpha species on the planet, because the only reason we are is because of technology. And so the question of where our higher intelligence and higher consciousness came from is a pretty critical one. And I found that the scientific answers couldn't provide it, and neither could the religious answers. The religious answers wanted to say, well, we are a special, unique creation of God, and it failed to explain why it's so obvious that we're some kind of a primate, some kind of an animal, therefore, that we're so similar to the other animals. But then science couldn't say how this leap had occurred, where suddenly we have tools and technology without which we would not be the alpha species. If you or I, well, maybe you, David, would fare better than me. If you were left in the wilderness for 3 days, 3 nights, you might make it through, but I think I would be in hospital sick, or I might have passed away. How is that possible that we're so ill adapted to our own planet? And where did the technology come from that meant we could light a fire, fire a gun, build a shelter, and therefore thrive in the way we have? And it intrigued me that Eric von Daniken was willing to name that problem, that gap. And it made sense to me when he said that the story of our evolution might be more coherent if we allowed for the possibility of external interventions giving us a nudge every so often. And it was the first time I'd heard that suggested. He wasn't the first person to suggest it, of course. You could read Plato 2,500 years ago say exactly the same thing and say that that was what he had come to believe. But it was Eric von Daniken who introduced me to that idea and just dropped those questions onto my desk of who are we, where did we come from, how did we get here, are we alone or are we in company? And those questions just bubbled away in the back of my brain for the next few decades, percolating away. And the questions never went away, so they were always things I wanted to get back to and probe into, which is what I have done now with Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden.
Yeah, and both books are just fantastic reads and have led to so many exciting new avenues of thought for me. And, you know, as we chatted about the other day, some of the odd things that have happened in my life, you've given me possibilities that I never would have thought about, particularly the green-eyed girl that I met in 1979 who wanted me to come aboard her spaceship. I mean, that's a story that I've told for a joke to my friends, like, ha, you know, I met this girl who was probably crazy or just a real funny one, you know, just pulling my leg. But in the back of my mind, I always thought,
what was that? Who was she?
Was
that for real?
There was something about those strange green eyes, and her beauty was almost too beautiful. She was like an angel. So she was somebody unusual.
And even the way she spoke to you.
Yeah, she was very forward, and she approached me at a coffee shop, and I was just young surfy guy just sitting there having a coffee, minding my own business. And I didn't mind a beautiful girl coming up to me, but the way she approached me was very in command, and the way she spoke, she said, "I'm not from around here." And I said, "Where are you from?" She said, "Well, I'm not from the earth." I went, "Really?" And she was dead serious, and she kept speaking in a very, and I was watching for, you know, I'd been a nurse. I was sort of very used to people. I was looking for signs of any kind of psychiatric illness. And all I saw was bright intelligence and directness. And she said, "I'd like you, you know, you're a good looking guy. I wouldn't mind if you wanted to come down with me, and I'll show you our ship. You know, it's going to meet me down at Redland Bay this Friday night." I used to go there a lot, surfing, going over to Stradbroke Island. But yeah, in your writings, the stories of the Mummy Wata and and the abduction, I saw that there's, you know, from all over the world, there's this these stories of people being taken and having children with people from the other side, the fairies, the Stockies, the whatever, there's so many different things.
Well, Eric von Däniken did something incredible with that book, because he did break the taboo, and he made these questions part of mainstream conversation. So the things we're talking about were suddenly being talked about on school playgrounds, at dinner parties, by adults and educated people who were not conspiracy theorists or fringe people. It was in the mainstream conversation because of what he did. And I thought it was really interesting what Eric said in that interview that we did on the Fifth Kind TV about the role of the writer and its relationship with academia. And he was saying that radical new ideas are unlikely to come from the tenured world of academics. It will come from the outside, possibly from people without PhDs, but who are just joining the dots, putting something on the table, and then the academics can discuss it. And he said that's the way ideas move forwards. And that's why real academics with real PhDs leak information to writers like Eric or myself, so that we can then popularize the content, put it on the table, and then they can have conversations about it. And I applaud him for taking that role, because whatever your level of education or expertise, you're going to get flack for taking that role. But it's absolutely vital in moving the public conversation forward. And so I take my hat off to Eric for doing that for us and taking the heat for the last half century.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of my first painting teacher back in the 90s. Was quite the artist's artist. He lived in this massive garret sort of derelict building that he got the rent for in exchange for a painting, and very bohemian. And he said to me, we as the artists are the court jesters of society. We can say things and think things that somebody with a staid career or reputation with peers, all that sort of stuff, would be too scared to say because they're afraid of it all being taken away. Whereas the artist and the writer, the thinker, like Eric, somebody putting yourself out there, it's the court jester's role. The court jester in that really old tradition was often super smart and pretended to be a fool. Is prepared to seem like a fool, to say the things that, and Paul said that, God uses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise,
That's exactly right. That's so true. It's the role of the artist, the creative, the storyteller, the filmmaker. And one of the things I mentioned in The Scars of Eden is if we took our artistic heritage as seriously as we took our ancient texts, then a different story of origins, again, would be staring us in the face. If we looked at paintings and carvings and took to them the question of who was Jesus, how was he born, who are we, where did we come from, then there would be different answers proposed. And in Escaping from Eden, I point out that what's in our ancient narratives, our ancestral narratives and our world mythology as an explanation for human origins, if you read the ancient texts, then every so often you'll be thinking, hang on, I saw this in a movie, or I read this in a book, and you'll have seen it in the context of fiction because that is how the information has been presented. Carl Sagan is a great for instance of this. He always presented himself as a real scientist's scientist. He would only assert things that could be scientifically proven or tested, and just really wouldn't stray too far beyond that. But if you read his fiction, well, that's when you find out what he believed. And he was willing to present things as fiction that he couldn't argue for as fact, because it was still an avenue open to him to get information out there. And anyone who goes back now and watches his old lectures and then watches his one novel that became the movie Contact, it's not hard to join the dots and realize that one could say in private, he held a view very different to what people remember him for, and far more aligned with someone like Erich von Däniken than he ever was prepared to go public with, other than right in the early days. If you read him in the 1960s, when he was arguing for the idea that human civilization was planted, nurtured by extraterrestrial visitors. And it's there in papers you can read to this day.
For a long time, I didn't like Sagan because I got involved with SETI, and then when I discovered what they were really about, I drew back. I thought, nah, this is ridiculous. Looking out, maybe one day,
yeah.
You know, unusual, what do they say? Extraordinary things need extraordinary
claims.
It's
yes.
Like, what does that mean? But then when I started to hear things, and I think it was particularly from you about his early beliefs, and then it must have been in one of your videos, I found he wrote Contact. I was like, wow.
And not only that, it was not just about his early beliefs. These are the beliefs he couldn't present as science, because he wrote Contact fairly late in the day. And when, let me see if I can remember which mission this was, when Ed Mitchell went to the moon, he was the sixth man to walk on the moon. I think he went there in 1972, just before the launch. The astronauts were taken to one side for a private briefing, and they were given the code word to use should they find themselves in company with extraterrestrials on the way to the moon, on the moon, or on the way back. And it was Carl Sagan who provided the code word.
Was it Grandma or something? Grandma's undies or something?
Yes, it was Grandma on that mission. That's right. I think it was Santa Claus in 1969, and it was Grandma in 1972. But it just shows you how involved he was in the whole area of contact today with our ET neighbors. And I like you, David, I've really wrestled with Carl Sagan because I found him really inspiring, his television work. And then when I found that he had so brutally attacked the credibility of Erich von Däniken, when Erich von Däniken was only quoting him, and then discover that in private he agreed with Erich von Däniken, and then was briefing the astronauts on ET contact, I went through a period of being very angry with him and thinking, what a hypocrite and what a vicious person to do something like that. And then I've had to calm down and think, well, actually, in his own way, he was putting information out there. The movie Contact is a wonderful contribution. And it's one of those movies, you can watch it as fiction and you can believe that it's fiction, but it will have passed on information to you that has a power all its own. And you could look at SETI and say, well, that is a huge diversion and distraction, and it's really kind of a smoke screen.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it was a way of keeping the topic on the boil, in conversation, and behind closed doors, he was doing other things. So I think I've come to a point of accepting he did what he felt he could do while having a job and having a voice and having a platform. And I don't like all of it, but that's just how it played out. I'm very happy in my book to go back and say, did you realize he also said this? Did you realize he also said this? And those who hold Carl Sagan in high esteem can go back and say, oh my goodness, now I need to think through the implications of these other things that he said.
Yeah, well, that's how it's affected me. What you've written about him has made me think I must reassess him. And one of the interesting things for me in the last few years is, as I've been researching psychic research, I met Uri Geller many years ago and
wonderful,
kept in contact with him. And, you know, I've always been really interested in him. And I'm the sort of person that believes people. If they tell me I can do this, and I don't pick up the vibe that they're a deceiver, and it goes on for years. I think this is fair dinkum. I'll believe this guy. And I've got a book called Superminds, which I found in an op shop. It's from 1975, and there's this professor. It's one of my treasures, but I just can't quite find it. But just very, very high profile professor of mathematics at Oxford, or, you know, one of the big name places. And he wrote this book about experiments he did on Uri Geller and a number of children. And there was this fakery went on with some of the children. And then that was sort of, they worked out what was going on and they changed the experiments. But you come to the end of the book and it's like, this guy's like started as an absolute cynic about this. And at the end he's going, there's definitely something. And his idea was electromagnetic. I think there's something to that, but I think it's much
beyond that.
Consciousness. It's about the quantum level, which is sort of light, is electromagnetism, you know, it's all the same sort of thing. But he then recanted a couple of years later and sort of wrote a book or wrote essays saying this was all rubbish and it was all whatever. And it shocked me because at the end of his book, he addressed the same things he was talking about, the accusations leveled against him and these experimenters, and he proved why it wasn't a fraud and why it was legit. But what shocked me was that the level of being got at that must have happened to him.
Oh, yes.
Destroyed. You won't have a career, you know, it'll be the end of you. You'll lose your house. You'll lose everything. Shut up, you know, for some reason.
Yes, I can think of a few people who've had that kind of experience where they came under such intense pressure to recant that they did recant, and then they couldn't live with themselves having recanted, and so there comes a later point where they recant the recantation. It really only draws your attention all the more seriously to their claims. But it's interesting you mention Uri Geller and that experience that you had with the brown-eyed girl, because one of the things I really hope people will take away from the Scars of Eden is that I'm calling on people to share their own anomalous stories, because I think if you sat down any friendship circle or family circle and asked the question, have you ever experienced anything strange, anomalous, that you can't explain, that you don't know what it was, and it's always bothered you, and even though you are puzzled over it and can't tell it as a coherent story, it's never gone away, it's always stayed with you? Every circle, every friendship circle, every family circle would have an answer to that, and possibly every individual would as well. And I think if we can listen to each other's "something really strange happened to me once" stories, a coherent picture will begin to emerge. And the picture has to do with, we're not alone on planet Earth, there are other presences here, and we're not alone in this corner of the cosmos. And I think if we can have conversations like that, listen to each other with respect rather than ridicule, then we're looking at a grassroots wave of disclosure that reveals we're in a far more interesting universe than we thought. And those experiences might be contact experiences, but they might also be consciousness experiences like the ones you're talking about. So many people I talk to have experienced many, many glimpses of precognition, glimpses of remote viewing, glimpses of telepathic connection, or they found they could do something Uri Geller-like that they then can't explain how they did it.
When you said about, you know, paintings in the past indicating, you know, perhaps extraterrestrial vehicles, you know, those astounding paintings from the Renaissance of like, it's got to be a flying saucer. It's got to be, you know, it's got like this shaped thing in perspective with these rays coming down. It's like, what is that? You know, what is that? Like, why would you draw that? You know, if it's a spiritual thing, you'd have a big winged angel or,
of course,
flying dragon or something.
Well, the answer that gets given, I think my favorite one of those Renaissance paintings that you're talking about is the Annunciation by Carlo Crivelli. And it is a painting that is supposed to portray the moment when Mary becomes pregnant with Jesus. So what does the painter paint? He paints Mary wearing a strange headgear with some kind of crystal in it, and a laser beam being shone into the headgear by a flying saucer in the sky. Any layperson looks at that and says, oh my word, that's different to what the written text says. That is some kind of technology, and that is some kind of artificial insemination that's going on there. And not only is it different to what's in the gospel texts, but it is the same as what is in the written texts surrounding the Yellow Emperor, Lao Tzu, Vipassi Buddha in the Eastern traditions. That is what he's painted, is how they describe what happened to the mothers of those great people.
How did this painter know it? You know, like I know you sort of have spoken about it, that the artist has a sort of a like a sixth sense to.
Well, either he has a sixth sense and in his artistic frame of mind is downloading information from a wider field of information, or he knows from another source and is leaking the information back into the public domain. And there's certainly a strong tradition of artists being connected with esoteric societies, secret societies that are curated forbidden knowledge, and then their role is to leak it bit by bit back into the public domain. So all of that can be going on, but I certainly believe that when we get into a creative frame of mind or a storytelling frame of mind, that's very often when we start downloading information without realizing that's what we're doing.
Yeah, right on. And I remember I'd known about, from Eric's, Eric von Daniken's work, those paintings of people in ships and different things that, he pointed out. But I was thinking about the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain when he goes up there with John and Peter, maybe James. And,
yes,
that's a whole story in itself. Like some great light thing comes down, a door opens, there's Moses and Elijah. That is pretty interesting. But then I started looking at the art related to that, all these Greek Orthodox icons and things, and they're all like they look like interdimensional ships or something. Jesus standing there as these amazing patterns and light. And
yes,
you can see why a scholar would say, oh, yeah, that's just a symbol. But
yes, yeah, I was on my way to making that point, actually, because if you show the Carlo Crivelli painting to an art historian, they'll say, oh, well, that is just the convention for portraying moments like that. Well, what does that mean? It means other artists have painted the same thing. That's all that's actually saying.
You're making that up.
And then the moment of the transfiguration is a really interesting one, because we're so used to interpreting that in a spiritualized way, but there are a number of texts that are perhaps clearer than that one through the Hebrew canon and into the New Testament, where what we're being shown is technology. And there are quite a few moments where self-propelling craft that can fly, that can arrive on Earth from space, that generate their own light, which would have been absolutely miraculous to our ancient ancestors viewing it, are described. And so the whole mystery of where's the light coming from in the Transfiguration story, well, there's a whole other context for that question once you've read those other stories.
The abilities of the ancient Egyptians and the Sumerians and Babylonians, and people sort of go, oh yeah, they look at it, but when you're an artist, you know what it takes to make things, and you look at it and go, wow,
yes,
really?
Well, that's right. And I think engineers look at ancient engineering with the proper sense of wonder, to see that all the principles and mathematical understanding that creates incredible megalithic structures were known, were in place, were being used all those thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
And where did that suddenly pop up from? It is acknowledged in the world of archaeology that there's a huge mystery around how the Sumerian civilization could suddenly appear with so much already in place, that they've got the civil engineering expertise, that they have a banking system, a legal system, they've got money, literature, chemistry, cosmology, almost like they got it in one hit. And there's no kind of evidence for the evolution of those things gradually taking the subsistence farmer, from that level to the building a city level. And that has long been acknowledged as a mystery that requires more careful study. And that is something I touch on in Escaping from Eden, because research just in the last 20 years has shone new light on that and said, yes, it was even more sudden and extraordinary than even we thought before.
I just wanted to ask you about superpowers that humans had in the Bible. Could you sort of tell me what you think about where that was coming from, like with the classic, say, Samson? I sent you a message, I don't know if you saw it, about the barren women in the Bible who had...
Oh, yes. Well, children. Yes, that's really interesting. The barren women in the Bible who then have kids, if we revisit those stories and ask what happened that took this infertile person to having a baby, what is the story that's told? Well, the first instance like that in the Hebrew canon is the experience of Abraham and Sarah, who are elderly, they're past childbearing, and then they have a close encounter with three Elohim. That's the Hebrew word. It means powerful ones. Now, these powerful ones turn up, and at the beginning of the conversation, they think they are just human beings. But they treat them with great deference and respect and offer them hospitality. And then these three powerful ones who look human say, you're going to have a baby, it's going to be very significant, and whole people groups are going to come from you. This is really interesting when he says whole people groups, and Abram's name gets changed to Abraham, which means the father of many nations. Even more interesting when you realize that Abraham and Sarah have counterparts in the Vedic stories, the progenitors of humanity. So Abraham and Sarah are the progenitors of the Hebrew people in the Hebrew stories, but their counterparts, Brahma and Saraswati, are the progenitors of the human race. And so this name, Abraham, that means the father of many peoples, wow, or many nations, or the father of the many peoples, we're thinking, oh, hold on, is this actually a new branch in the whole story of Homo sapiens that we're looking at, that results from an interaction between ETs, because that's what the powerful ones were. They are the sky people of the Sumerian stories. They've interacted with these humans, and then another story emerges of Homo sapiens sapiens. That is the story that repeats in cultures all around the world. Different names, but that same shape of the story is there. That's the story that Plato told. So that's a really interesting moment. Close encounter with sky people, aka Elohim, what we would call extraterrestrials, and then this infertile couple have not only a child, but a very significant child, with the stories of Lao Tzu, or the Yellow Emperor, Jesus, John the Baptist. Their births are described in a way that absolutely echoes the Abraham and Sarah and Isaac story. Why is that? Why do they have a close encounter with a non-human and then they're pregnant? But those parallels are absolutely there. And you mentioned Samson, so Samson is one of those. And those aren't the only episodes where human beings encounter non-humans in the Bible, and then they produce either a very significant child or an anomalous child, like Samson, who is much, much larger than everybody else. Genesis 6 is perhaps the earliest moment Well, we've got that kind of adventure described, where it says that the Bene Elohim, which literally means the sons of the powerful ones, but it could mean it in the sense of the ones like the powerful ones, and put that in the context of the whole storyline, and you realize it's the second wave of powerful ones in the storyline. So it's the second ET incursion. They turn up because they want to get some of the human DNA into their own gene pool. It says they've observed the daughters of men, the human females. They find them very attractive, and they say, let's have some of that in our gene pool. And the offspring they produce don't stop growing. They become the Titans, as the Greeks called them, the Nephilim, as the Hebrews called them, the people of legend, who are very, very large. And Samson is an example of that kind of person. Or the Anakim, a race of giants, again, part of the story in the Bible. And so we've got these abduction, hybridization stories from very early on in the Bible. And then as I toured the world in preparation for the Scars of Eden, I realized that that story of abduction and hybridization is told in every culture in the world. You can go down the eastern seaboard of Africa to the southern cone, all up the western seaboard into the Caribbean, as far east as the Philippines, where they have language that only exists to tell these stories. That language has its roots in Sanskrit, and so it goes further east. You go into Europe, the whole of Europe is named after an abductee. Europa was the daughter of a king of Phoenicia, and she was abducted by a non-human, made to have 3 hybrid children. One of them was Minos, the progenitor of the Minoan culture, who suddenly emerged with all this high tech. Now, that story I've just told, in Greece, that's taught as history. And the whole of Europe is named after that woman who had that experience. So that's not a fringe story. That's right in the roots of where we all came from, according to European story. Then you can go into the Norse countries. You've got the same story there. The Celts tell the same stories. And the details that recur in these abduction hybridization narratives are really extraordinary. Because if you go to Wales, you will hear every detail repeating that is in the Ghanaian story, or in any of those that I've mentioned. And the details are these: that there is another presence on planet Earth that looks human, but is not human. They're very attractive, but there are a couple of clues that they're not human to do with skin color and the shape of the top lip. They will lure people. They usually don't take people by force. They will lure people to come with them with promises of heightened abilities, heightened health, heightened prosperity as a result, and a promise that they'll be returned later. They will be taken to underwater bases where they will be used for hybridization and then returned a few years later. Now, it's the most bizarre, unlikely sounding story, and yet every one of the details I've given is repeated in the cultures I've named, whether you're listening to the story of Tylwyth Tig in Wales, or the story of the Mamiwata in Ghana, or the Mahurani in Kenya. Why would every culture tell that story and have those details repeating? The answer I put forward in the Scars of Eden is they're telling the truth, that they are curating a story that is ages old, and that when people today report these experiences, we react as if we'd never heard the like before, and yet that flies in the face of our ancestors working so hard to curate these stories so that every generation knows them. And in effect, they're saying, we will never understand what happens on this planet until we realize there is another layer to the governance of Project Earth that is not human. It's funny you say that, though, David, because I think everyone has a different white rabbit that will lead them down a different rabbit hole, but ultimately we'll find we're all in the same rabbit warren when we get down there. So for your friend, he has noticed something that's got his attention about some of the leaders of the world that he's trying to puzzle out.
Yeah.
And so he's got that's niggling away at him. What's going on? There seems to be a non-human aspect to it. Given time, that will lead him onto territory where he realizes we're in company, and that company has to do with the fact that we're in a populated universe. And what you're saying about, there can't be aliens in contact with us, because how could they get here? Other populated planets are so far away that if they caught a glimpse of us, we'd all be extinct by the time they got here. It's funny because that's actually Newtonian physics. The moment somebody says it would take them too long to get here, that's Newtonian physics. Yes. Where time is the prime organizing principle, and then you just put the distance over time, and you've got speed, and you've got impossibility. But in fact, Einstein begins to unravel all of that. And albeit he said, you can't travel faster than light because the properties of light are now the prime organizing principle. Nevertheless, it was Einstein and Rosen who proposed Einstein-Rosen bridges that shows how you can travel without traveling through space, or what some people might call traveling through a wormhole, taking the short route. So if you've got that as a possibility from Einstein, you realize that Einstein has really broken the old Newtonian paradigm. But the fact is that if you are confronted with something that inescapably leads you to the conclusion that we're in contact with people who come from somewhere else, the question suddenly changes from how could they possibly get here to how did they get here? And those are two slightly different questions, ultimately with the same answer. But my start point is not what appears to be possible from the general theory of relativity. My start point is what have our ancestors been telling us for thousands of years? And what's the continuity between that and what we're experiencing today? And then how do we process that? And it leads us to that second question of how did they get here?
So yeah, we come to that whole Jesus story where John 14:12, Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing, and greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father." And I remember when I first read that, who knows how many years ago, I thought, what? We are going to do greater things than you, who like walked on water, raised the dead, turned water into wine, was tempted by the devil for 40 days, you didn't eat, drink, all that stuff, healing lepers. It always sort of got me what it would be to be a leper, all sort of eaten away, and then somebody comes along and goes, be healed, and then you got beautiful fresh skin again. I think there was a novel I loved called Dear and Glorious Physician. I don't know if you would have heard of that, but
no,
about Luke. It's sort of, Taylor Caldwell was this famous writer. Did he write The Robe? Might have, but sort of Christian novels from the 50s. But it had this wonderful scene where Jesus heals this leper and the arm sort of grows. The guy's like missing an arm from leprosy, and the arm grows before everyone's very eyes. And it was such a good imaginative description of the wonder of such a thing and such a person. But here he is saying to us, you'll do greater things than me. It's possible for you to do greater things than me. And I remember speaking to my minister at school, a man who I really admired, and I was probably 16, and I said, what does he mean by this? Where is all this stuff? This is 2000 years ago. Where's all the miracles happening? Who can do this? Can you do this? And he was very disturbed, and he knew I was intelligent. He said, look, it's very hard for me to explain this, but he said, we're in a different dispensation.
Ah, yes.
And I thought, that's a pretty weak explanation.
Yes.
Different dispensation.
It's a non-explanation. Yeah. It is just restating the question. He's just saying they don't happen today. Your experience will be similar to mine, that we've actually seen glimpses of that power being exercised by people before our very eyes, and that it actually bears out the whole idea that Jesus puts forward in the gospel, that he is a model for us, that we are to do as we see him do. That includes the confident, fearless living that we see, where he's willing to live not terrified of poverty, not terrified of death,
Yes.
not terrified of the powers. And then he shows us this incredible power that can have healing outcomes in people's bodies, this power that can affect entity removal from people who are suffering that way. And he announces himself as a model in essence with his very first sermon in the Gospels. If you go to the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew gives a little summary of the talk that Jesus toured with at the beginning of his public ministry. And it comes back to what you're saying, David, about the importance of translating the words properly. And I argue in the Scars of Eden, we should use the root meanings of the words, the simple, straightforward, brute meanings of the words, and see how the stories come across then. You know, if we say sky or space instead of heavens, go to this first sermon and we've got words that are layered with centuries of cultural associations. So it's now very difficult to hear the sentence in
Yes.
anything like its original meaning. So we've got in a conventional translation, we've got Jesus saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Well, that sounds like a warning, doesn't it?
Yes.
It sounds like he's saying, you get your life cleaned up because God is about to turn up and you don't want to be in trouble with him. That's what it sounds like with those words, with everything we've layered on top. The word repent, you go to the Greek word, it means beyond the mind. Go
Really?
beyond your mind.
Wow.
So what does that mean? Yeah, it can mean all sorts of things. It means change your mind, transform your mind, go beyond the mind, think with something beyond this. That meaning is actually maintained and taught by the Apostle Paul when he says, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the transformation, the renewal of your mind, your whole way of thinking. So Jesus is calling for a different way of thinking with that word, not clean your life up, go beyond the mind, repent. And then we've got for the kingdom of God. Now, the kingdom sounds like a feudal society, doesn't it? With a big boss at the top and obedient people underneath. And of course, that's often the way Christianity has behaved. It's often been a device for refeudalizing society,
Yes.
especially in the Episcopal churches with bishops who then sit within the civic structure of the empire. That's how it worked with the Roman Empire. That's how it works with bishops sitting in the House of Lords in Great Britain, so on and so forth. Kingdom, there's another word you could use, and that's realm. Technically, they mean exactly the same thing. But if you use the word realm, then what's that telling you? That's a place of what? Of wonder, of exploration.
Yes.
The realm of the heavens, which is the space or is cosmos. So let's retranslate the whole thing. He's saying, go beyond the mind, transform your mind. You can transform your mind because the amazing power of the cosmos is available to you. That's what at hand means. You can reach out and take hold of it. So he's saying the amazing power of the cosmos is available to all of us, and we need to change our whole paradigm because of it. And then he goes around healing people and transforming people and loving people and talking about how to live without destroying yourself and living this fearless supernatural life. It's all of a piece. And a number of times he's saying, anyone who believes in me can do the things I've been doing. I've done this so that you can follow my example. And that reframes the whole of the Gospels for us. We watch him very differently when we're realizing he's modeling the amazing availability of the power of the cosmos that's there for all of us. And it's a far more empowering message than if you read it in the traditional translation. The traditional translation is very friendly to anyone who wants to use Christianity to put people down and disempower them and make them frightened.
Yes.
Translate it the other way, and it's an empowering message.
Wow, that is so great. Thank you for that. That's, you know, it's the translation, it's the dogma that put me off.
Indeed. Well, there we are. To me, in that, you've got Jesus saying this is available to all. There are no boundaries around that. That's not just only for religious people or people who are into God. That's a message for everybody.
Yeah.
Paul repeats it when he preaches this incredible, gives this amazing speech in Athens to a group of people who don't know anything about his Judaism and don't know anything about Christianity. And so he finds he has to define God from scratch. And so he says, by God, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being.
Mm.
Now, if that's his definition of God, it's so empowering because it means we are all intimately connected with the source and the power of the source. There's no separation. Religion trades on separation anxiety, the idea that we have to claw our way back into a connection with God, and we, the religious leaders, will tell you how to do that. Paul blows that to pieces with that speech. He says we all live and move and have our being in the source. Our very being comes from the source. Our consciousness is from source consciousness, our intelligence from source intelligence. And so it's a very empowering vision that requires us to do nothing. And he mocks the idea in that speech of sacrificial religion. The idea that the source needs us to do things for it is ridiculous the moment you understand God as the source.
Paul writing.
So that's Paul writing, absolutely seamless with that earlier thing that Jesus said, go to Peter on the day of Pentecost, and you've got the early believers exhibiting this extraordinary power that's on display in them. They're speaking languages they've never learned. How is this happening? Have they switched on some bit of the brain somehow that all of us would like to be able to? And Peter explains it by quoting from the Hebrew scriptures. And he said, no, this is that which was written in the last days, says the Lord, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. And again, not just on believers, not just on religious people. No, this is something for all flesh. And you read the book of Acts and you realize as the apostles go around, they find people having these experiences of cosmic power before ever they turn up and start talking about God and Jesus. The experience is already there. So I love those touch points because in my life, I have found people of every nationality, every ethnicity, every spiritual tradition, and none who have found that they can tap the amazing power of the cosmos in extraordinary ways. And so you might go to someone who's a Reiki practitioner, not a believer in Jesus necessarily. They may or may not be. But what are they doing? They're doing exactly the same thing Jesus did when he laid a hand on somebody and then saw a healing outcome. And I love that paradigm for the kingdom of God or the realm of the source because it is absolutely invitational. When Jesus says, you'll be able to do everything I did and more, what greater invitation could there be than that to explore what's possible? And on my website, paulanthonywallis.com, I have a little section. In the explore section, go to 4 Elements Healing, and I share some stories of healings that I've experienced, that I've been involved with, that really have to do with human beings learning the power we have over our own bodies, over the bodies of others, and it's tapping cosmic energy, cosmic principles in a way that Christians understand, if they're in a Pentecostal or charismatic tradition, but that you can find in every ethnicity, a shamanic tradition, mystical tradition, around the planet. And again, just seeing how prevalent it is an amazing invitation to explore what's possible.
Yeah. Well, you're a great thinker. Like we spoke the last time, I could talk to you all day. I really could. But I can't be greedy. Are you happy to speak for another?
Sure thing. For you, David, of course.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I just firstly, that verse you're talking about the kingdom of heaven, repent. Do you remember what verse exactly that is? Like what?
I think it's Matthew chapter 4, verse 7. It's one I like to go to because to me it's so sad what's happened to those words. Repent is such a negative word that strikes fear into people, that says God is somebody that you should fear. He's going to punish you if you don't sort yourself out. And that message is not there in the Gospels when you do the translation work. The word hell is another one I should mention because, the church for so long has taught this idea that we should all live in terror of hell, that if we're on the wrong side of God, he will torture us for eternity. And anyone who hears that doctrine must surely think, well, that's a little bit out of proportion, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not right.
An infinite punishment for a finite crime, or a crime where you didn't even know it was a crime. And it turns out, again, you do the translation work, Jesus does not talk about hell in the Gospels. He talks about Gehenna, which was the rubbish tip on the edge of Jerusalem. And what he's actually doing is warning people against behaviors that are destructive or self-destructive, behaviors that will ruin your life or the lives of others and end you on the scrap heap of life full of regret and remorse.
Yeah.
As soon as you realize that's what he's on to, you realize he's actually come to help us live better lives and have a better human experience, not come to warn us about an angry God who's about to turn up and punish us all.
Yeah.
And it's a totally different approach to life that you're going to come to on the basis of which way you read it. Are you going to live as some terrified, I must be in compliance all the time person? What do I do now, Lord? Or are you going to live as this, wow, there are these amazing possibilities. Let's find out what this human life could be. And that's where I get to when I read these other stories of beginnings and the ones hidden in plain sight in the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament as well.
Wow. That's a wonderful place for us to finish our chat today. You've left me feeling very excited about the future. Thanks so much for sharing your wonderful thinking. And I'd like to request that you translate the Bible and put out the...
In my spare time. Yeah. Just retranslate the Bible. Yes, I do it in bits. I focus on some bits in the Scars of Eden and Escaping from Eden. But yes, I hear what you're saying. The task of retranslating and reframing what our ancestors have worked so hard to curate in those texts is really, really important, because so much has flowed from them through history, some of which has been very destructive, and so much could flow from them that could be empowering as to our understanding of our own selves and our own potential. So I agree, it's work that definitely needs to be done.